In January of 2006, the PlayStation 2 survival horror game Rule of Rose would be released in Japan. A mere few months later, the game would ignite a panic in Europe, causing it to become one of the most sought-after titles of all time, ensuring its place in history as a cult classic. First developed by Japanese studio Punchline and published by Sony Japan, our tale unfolds amidst sleepy old England, tracing 19-year-old Jennifer's horrifying journey from early spring to the winter of 1930, as she stumbles through the mysterious Rose Garden orphanage. As Jennifer explores the seemingly abandoned orphanage, she is abducted by a group of girls calling themselves the Red Crayon Aristocrats, and whisked away to a mysterious airship. Jennifer awakens and finds herself bound to a support beam. A mysterious young boy appears over the intercom to explain to Jennifer the Rule of Rose. All members of the Red Crayon Aristocrats must provide a gift to the prince and princess, or be punished severely, regardless of social class. The game itself plays like a fairly bog-standard survival horror of the time, finding similarities with games like Kuon, Haunting Grounds, and Siren, though with a combat system far worse than any of them. Rule of Rose brings with it the unique addition of a silent film flair in both the UI and various text menus that appear throughout, as well as a looping, melancholy soundtrack that is trance-like in its ability to immerse you in the setting. Without going into too many spoilers, the rest of the game features Jennifer and her dog Brown exploring the airship and the orphanage, uncovering the secrets hidden within and revealing a tragic secret. What has elevated this game to truly legendary status is not the beautiful story littered with delicate and beautifully woven metaphors or its rich atmosphere, but the enormous controversy generated upon release. The first signs of trouble would appear at 2006's E3 convention. Sony America announced that they would be declining to release the game in the United States, calling it incompatible with their image. When your own publisher's subsidiary pulls out of distributing your game, you know trouble is brewing. Thankfully, Atlus, creator of the Shin Megami Tensei, Persona, and various other legendary series, would pick up right where Sony America left off. They too were nervous at first, having some doubts about a horror game featuring almost entirely children, and the PR nightmare it could spawn. Tom Hewlett, a game designer for WayForward and member of Atlus's publishing committee, was assigned to play through the game and give the final yes or no. Having completed the game, Hewlett was relieved to find a deep, immersive, and thoughtful horror experience that featured, in his words, nothing so terrible. With the green light from Hewlett, Atlus was delighted to distribute a mainline Sony game, viewing it as a major win. Rule of Rose would release in the US in September of 2006 to middling reviews and decent sales in the range of 10 to 20,000 copies. Not bad for a Japanese horror game in the era before YouTubers made it popular. Following this rather unremarkable release, Atlus set to work preparing for a European launch a few months down the line. Unbeknownst to Atlus, a storm was brewing in the offices of Italian weekly magazine Panorama. Panorama is a Milan-based general news and lifestyle magazine that has been running weekly editions since 1939 and remains in publication today. Somehow, someway, their mid-October 2006 issue would feature a full-cover picture of Diana and Meg, two of the higher-ranking aristocrats in the Rule of Rose. The headline, "Who Buries the Girl Alive Wins." Within the magazine, journalist Guido Castellano wrote a scathing review of the game, comparing it to titles such as Bully and Postal 2. Now, that alone wouldn't be enough to cause panic. But Castellano's claim was that the game was filled with violent and erotic content featuring largely underage girls. That would surely do the trick. To quote Mr. Castellano, "Every frame is dripping with perversion, and every scene features homoerotic and sadistic subtext, which we were just not ready for." Now, is the game violent? Yes, moderately, but nothing really to write home about compared to other titles and action games of the era. In the very same article, Castellano quotes one of the designers as taking pride in the scenes and eroticism littered throughout the game. If you want to be generous, we can assume Castellano didn't quite understand the English translation of this interview, or is really just reaching. The interview Castellano quotes is with developers Yuya Takayama and Shuji Ishikawa, and done by Gamasutra, who, may I add, was really leading with some of their questions. Gamasutra asks about the themes of sexuality in the game. Takayama explains that the game is about intimate familiarity, that the things children do may seem sexual or have hidden undertones to adults, but are really rather benign. The game truly shines when it contrasts the perspective of children and the peculiarity they can inspire in adults. That ultimately, children and adults live in two different, sometimes frightening worlds. Castellano was, of course, not looking that deeply. If you want my opinion, he casually stretched the truth to get some easy outrage readers. Anyone who has played more than a few minutes of the game would realize everything written in his article is patently untrue. To address some of his claims, one at a time, there is a scene in which Jennifer is put into a coffin, though she is not buried alive but merely transported elsewhere. There are absolutely no erotic scenes in the entire game, The only scene that could even be described as remotely intimate occurs in the opening cutscene, which features Jennifer and Wendy holding hands, rubbing noses together, and professing their love to one another. The love oath in the game's opening is not lustful as Castellano would imply, but the same as I imagine any kid did when they were playing house or make-believe at that age. Now sure, you might be able to call that homoerotic, whatever that means. If your takeaway from that Mr. Castellano is rampant perversion, it might say more about you than Rule of Rose. The one interview that Castellano did not need to stretch was with the spokeswoman of the Movement for Defending Citizens, who states that she and other concerned parents are organizing to ban the sale of Rule of Rose from Italian stores. The spokeswoman is quoted saying, "It is outrageous to think our children could have access to a game where the objective is to bury a little girl alive. With sadism, violence, and initiation rites, what will our children learn from these games?" Yet again, it's clear that no one has played the game. Finally, the article closes with a quote from the mayor of Rome. Yes, the mayor had nothing better to do than comment on niche Japanese survival horror. Mayor Veltroni writes, "It's incredible to think a game with such violent content can be published in our country." Not only that, but Veltroni states that it should be any politician's first objective to ban Rule of Rose from Italy. Surely there had to be any number of things more important to do, right? Despite these inflammatory statements, Rule of Rose would still, several weeks later, release in Italy. PEGI, Europe's video game content rating organization, rated the game 16+. A fair rating in my eyes. For what was likely a poorly researched filler article, word of the game quickly spread across the European continent. A number of British magazines such as The Times and the Daily Mail pounced on the story, of course not verifying if anything said was actually true. The British magazines would largely translate and print the Panorama article word for word, adding further confusion onto an already smoldering fire. As more and more articles appeared across Europe, Minister of Justice for the European Union, Franco Frattini, declared to the European Parliament that games like Rule of Rose should be banned outright, that such harsh punishment should be wrought down upon developers. They would never dream of making another game such as this. Frattini's next target would be PEGI itself, calling to reform the organization as clearly they were failing to reform their duties to the European people. Then, General Secretary of the Video Game Standards Council, Laurie Hall, responded with, "I have no idea where the suggestions of in-game sadomasochism has come from, nor children being buried underground. These are things that have been completely made up. We're not worried about our integrity being called into question because Mr. Frattini's quotes are nonsense." Mrs. Hall stood behind the 16+ rating and firmly rebuffed the nonsense coming out of the EU. The controversy itself had very real effect on sales. In France, the release of the game was cut back massively, leading to only a few hundred copies being released. In the UK, New Zealand, and Australia, the game would be panned almost altogether, with a small number of copies being sold under the table from various game stores who were left holding the bag. This controversy would cause the game to become incredibly rare, with used copies commanding a price of around $300, new copies going for around $700, and factory-sealed copies going for as high as $20,000. To this day, the only legitimate English copies to exist come from the initial middling print run of American sales, and whatever snuck out in the UK. Now, this is enough drama for any game, let alone a tiny Japanese release made by a studio of about 25 people. If you thought it was over, well, we've got yet another twist. The man behind the panic, Guido Castellano, as one might expect, didn't do much research before publishing his article. In fact, the majority of it was plagiarized. Castellano lifted much of the article directly from an old game forum post written by Remothered's Chris Dyrrell, who managed to play an early Japanese copy thanks to some friends. Castellano didn't even try and change the words around, lifting phrases like the thick and sharp thorns of the Game of Rose, and copying character descriptions from the forum post word for word. News of this plagiarism spread across various gaming boards, and suddenly Panorama was the one on the back foot, as they received a huge deluge of complaints, eventually pulling the article long after the damage was done. Daryl and a number of other journalists reached out to Panorama for comment, hoping to see their sources as well as where they've derived some of their information from. They of course did not hear back. Daryl at the time was only a teenager, so there wasn't much he could do. He was just forced to let the issue go. Today, he says, he would have quickly called a lawyer and settled the issue. Fresh off the heels of this controversy around Rockstar's Bully, Rule of Rose just didn't have the clout or money behind it to fight off these allegations. Long before Japanese survival horror really became popular, publishers weren't willing to die on this hill. While there remains alternative ways of playing Rule of Rose today, it's pretty likely you won't be booting it up on your PS2 anytime soon, unless you've got a fat chunk of change lying around. I highly recommend giving it a rip yourself. While the combat is atrocious, so much so that the developers have apologized for it, the story itself is gripping and a backing soundtrack that is pensive and sorrowful. I won't spoil the game for you, but if you're looking for something short and meaningful to get you in the fall mood, I implore you to give Rule of Rose a go, if for no other reason to push back against the idiots who caused its untimely demise. With that, I'm going to end this video with this. As an American, I'm glad to say it wasn't us this time.